LiSTNR production.
Fraud is often seen as a quiet crime. No sirens, no bloodshed, no smoking gun.
I knew it was bad, I just didn't know how bad at the time.
But behind the spreadsheets and shelf companies lies a complex world of deception, cover-ups, and billions of dollars lost.
He was also having quite a cosy relationship with some very well-known IT contractors, and of course, he was responsible for the organisation running government IT in the UK.
Enter Dr. Peter Tickner, an expert in forensic auditing, or as he likes to call it, frauditing.
I think they used to use me as a bogeyman to frighten people.
Peter spent decades sniffing out corruption in some of the UK's most powerful institutions, from the NHS to the Metropolitan Police.
A team came from the Commissioner's office and said they had a priority over you, and it's gone to the Commissioner. So the allegations were about the Commissioner, and the papers had gone to the Commissioner's office. I could not believe what I was hearing.
He followed paper trails most people never knew existed. His work sits at the intersection of accountancy and investigation. Less CSI, more spreadsheet autopsy. But the stakes, just as high.
So they called him into the office on a Friday afternoon. They said, "Have you been on the fiddle?" And he said, "Yes, I resign." Went straight out, collected a van, drove to the government restaurant where he was the catering manager. The security staff let him in because they didn't know he'd been fired and sacked and resigned. Cleaned out all the vending machines, burnt all the records, and with the help of the security guard loaded the van, and off he went.
In this episode, Dr. Tickner takes us inside the mindset of a frauditor. The red flags, the resistance, and the surprising stories hiding behind the numbers. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public, so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
You can take modern auditing back to the South Sea bubble. After everybody was ripped off about ships and a coffeehouse spending and money, the king and the government at the time in 1720 nearly fell from power. And on the back of it, there was a change in legislation, and that every time a ship went out to sail out to do these wonderful things in the new world, they had to have an auditor with them. An internal auditor is what I really became in life, and to check up on them. So people have forgotten that auditors were about stopping fraud and abuse. That was why they existed. I'm not really an auditor, I'm a frauditor.
And how did you become involved in this line of work?
When I started work, by accident, I ended up in something called health service audit in the UK. And health service audit in those days, back in the early 70s, was very much about checking the cash of the cashiers, counting the money in the vending machines, generally being a pain up the proverbial to the whole organisation and not doing anything of any real value. But out of the back of that, about the first job I was sent out on was on a psychiatric ward where patients were given out money by the government every week for what they were doing. I was just standing there, and the first patient that got their money just turned to the charge nurse and said, "Here's your cut bill." And that was my first experience of fraud at the age of 19. I knew it was bad, I just didn't know how bad at the time. But from the back of that, I was luckily trained by a colleague who had the same kind of mind as me. And we saw all these kinds of frauds that everybody was avoiding. But we were supposed to be just the external auditors. We weren't supposed to be finding frauds. And then later on in life, I taught people about how to do what I could do. And I ended up at Her Majesty's Treasury as their chief auditor. Almost immediately, I found a major scandal there as well, which nobody had noticed in 20 years. And then I caught an undersecretary on the fiddle and sent him to prison. It's still the highest, as far as I know, ranking civil servant ever sent to prison.
Did you come from an accountancy background? How do you get into that? It's almost forensic accountancy, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the end, I ended up running sort of all sorts of forensic accounting things. But when I started out, I was just a trainee auditor learning the ropes.
Are you able to put any light on the 20-year discovery that you made at Her Majesty's Treasury? Are you under some sort of a gag order that we don't want you getting sent off to the tower or anything like that?
No, I mean, the work I did at Her Majesty's Treasury is all public knowledge. I mean, the Undersecretary that was sent to prison was certainly public knowledge. I mean, the guy was just a fraudster. He was just a chancer. He was a womanizer. He misbehaved. He just generally abused the system to his own benefit and thought it owed him a living. And he literally fiddled everything from taxi expenses when he'd actually taken an official car to then claiming an official car petrol when he borrowed a petrol thing from another government department, was using theirs and didn't pay a penny for it. And then he claimed that he'd made the same journey by some other means. There were occasions when he claimed the same journey 3-4 times. I mean, such petty stuff that why would anybody do that at that level? And we had all the senior officials of Treasury. He looked at all their expenses, and occasionally they made mistakes. But this one guy always made mistakes in his own favour, every time. And he never let his secretary fill in his expense forms. So we knew we were onto a winner. And then, of course, he turned out that he was also having quite a cosy relationship with some very well-known IT contractors. And, of course, he was responsible for the organisation running government IT in the UK, advising government IT procurement. Yeah, funny enough, rugby union comes into it. He ended up at the France-England game that particular year when we nailed him. Although he claimed, according to his official expenses claims, he'd returned to England on the Friday. He hadn't. He'd been entertained by a well-known French company that does technology to take him to the rugby, where he'd been. And while he was there, he collected taxi receipts lying on the floor and put them in as fake claims as well.
This was a guy that was involved in what we would call sort of low-level stuff, like walking around picking up taxi chits off the floor.
Petty fraud.
Yes, but then also, are you saying that he was also behind larger forms of fraud with getting backhanders from contractors and things such as that?
We weren't allowed to pursue that. That was where the Treasury was very careful. But you can take it as read that he was only having these cosy relationships for personal gain. He wasn't doing it for any other reason. So I then was looking at the Treasury ran civil service catering in those days. It was an in-house operation and it just came under the Treasury's control. The John Major's government in 1992 were going to privatise it. So the management of civil service catering knew this and decided to set up a corrupt arrangement so that they could win a management buyout and promptly sell the company to a well-known commercial provider and walk away with $750,000 each. So they set this all up and they nearly got away with it because I wasn't particularly paying any attention to civil service catering because the Treasury did things like be responsible for the Bank of England and the national debt. And those are the kinds of things as an auditor I was taking an interest in, not a small catering organisation doing 300-odd government catering restaurants up and down the country. But their attention was brought to me because one of the catering managers was on the fiddle. And when we looked into it, they called him into the office on a Friday afternoon. Never call a suspect into the office on a Friday afternoon. That's the stupidest thing you can do. So they called him into the office on a Friday afternoon. They said, "Have you been on the fiddle?" And he said, "Yes, I resign." Went straight out, collected his brother, collected a van, drove to the government restaurant where he was the catering manager. The security staff let him in because they didn't know he'd been fired and sacked and resigned. And he went in there, cleaned out all the vending machines, burnt all the records, collected anything spare stock he could lay his hands on with, and with the help of the security guard, loaded the van, and off he went.
And the investigation into him started on Monday, after all the evidence had disappeared.
Yes, my investigation started on Monday, yeah. And I was suitably impressed. So on the back of that, I called in another firm of accountants to help me, because I only had a very small team at the Treasury. And we looked at the whole of the catering structure, and we realised there was something wrong. So at that point, my boss agreed to call in the chief executive of the organisation to London, while I turned up with a team of staff at Basingstoke and raided his offices, which we did. And when we raided his offices, we found some very interesting things. And on the back of me arriving, half the staff fled out the building and disappeared, shouting out, "The auditors are here," which was a very interesting reaction to my appearance. But on the back of that, we seized all the documents, and we realised when we looked through them that they had set up a catering organisation, a rival organisation, made their wives the directors, made them the shareholders. Our catering organisation was called Civil Service Catering. And they were planning to win the management buyout by contacting all our major suppliers for, people like Coca-Cola, who always gave you a discount at the end of the year, saying to them, "Don't give us our discount this year, sit on it, and once we've been privatised, we'll come back to you for the discount." And that way, making themselves looking less profitable to the government so they wouldn't sell it for as much so they could win the management buyout. This was their plan. But we scuppered that plan. And we investigated about 20 catering managers, all of whom got into trouble. Mass resignations, police called in, all sorts of things and fun and games. And on the back of that, there was a parliamentary inquiry into civil service catering in which one of the people said to my boss, who was the second permanent secretary at the time of the Treasury dealing with that, he said, "The truth of the matter, Mr. Scholar, isn't it? The Treasury couldn't run a tea shop." He was right. We couldn't.
After a period of time, you stepped across and became the Director of Internal Audit for London's Met Police, based out of Scotland Yard. You uncovered a little bit of gear there, I would imagine, too.
Well, I have to tell you that everywhere I've ever worked in my life, whether it was the NHS, the Treasury, or the Met Police, I've always found frauds. I've always found corruption. I've always found abuse. If you appoint me, this is what's going to happen. But in fact, the Met was looking for somebody like me. I just actually investigated another case at the Treasury after that, which involved the corrupt award of a security guarding contract. Because the Treasury in those days was responsible for the security guarding in Downing Street. They wanted to take it away from the in-house team, and they wanted to give it to a contractor. So instead of just saying, well, we're not going to have outsourced bids, we're just going to award it to one of these contractors, they said, no, anybody can bid, including the in-house team. The in-house team submitted a winning bid, but didn't get the job. Now, before the in-house team got the job, my deputy at the time, her partner, was down the local Conservative club and overheard a friend of his saying that he'd just won a contract to the Treasury. So he said, "Which contract have you won?" And he said, "I've just won the security guarding contract." So she came in to tell me, very pleased, "Peter, I know who's won the security guarding contract." I said, "That's very good. We haven't had the shortlisting yet." So I said, "Right, we'll wait and see. And if your friend gets that contract, on the day that contract's awarded, we're seizing all the papers." So on the day the contract was duly awarded to the guy who told my friend's husband that he was going to get the contract, the next thing, "What the bloody hell do you think you're doing, Peter?" Phone calls raining in on me. You know, "How dare you? How dare you interfere with what the Treasury's doing?" Well, I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I had information that who was going to win the contract 2 months before it happened, so I think I have to act." But the end result of that case was they all agreed there'd been a screw-up. They could have just awarded the contract to these people without dressing it up as a proper procurement exercise when it wasn't. But by doing it, they bent all the rules. And I was quite right. And I had a Cambridge mathematician helping me on the numbers. They kept on producing these spreadsheets saying this is why these people won the contract. And we'd go through the spreadsheets and find that people had actually physically changed the figures so the spreadsheet didn't add up right. But we recalculated the whole thing and, of course, proved that they'd lied every time. So eventually I was called into the Permanent Secretary's office and said, "Peter, you know, this is all very embarrassing. We're not going to publish a report. But thank you for your work, and we will deal with the people concerned." So I knew then my career at the Treasury was finished. And luckily, at that very moment, Scotland Yard were just having to report to Parliament about why the Deputy Head of Finance had stolen £5 million from, of all things, an anti-IRA operation. So they were desperate for a new Chief Auditor. I was desperate for a job away from the Treasury, and the two came together in perfect timing. Because they didn't want just a Chief Auditor, they wanted somebody who actually was a frauditor. And the first thing that they told me when I got there, the Deputy Commissioner took me on one side and he said, "Look, we need you to go around all our covert and secret areas and make sure that there's not another Tony Williams, Laird of Tomintoul, the guy who'd stolen all the money, living there. So perhaps a bit of background on Laird of Tomintoul might help." The guy was originally, the Met used to just move people around to different jobs. So he didn't have any particular skills in finance, although the press at the time said, you know, Met Police accountant steals $5 million. He was never an accountant. He was just a senior manager. But what happened was he'd been in the Works Department, and then he managed to get promotion from the Works Department to become the Deputy Head of Finance. And when he arrived there, it was just the point, this was in the early 80s, the Met was thinking about a different way of dealing with the IRA mainland bombing threat. And one of the ideas they came up with was a covert plane. Now, don't worry, this is all public knowledge. I'm not telling you anything that isn't known. So this plane was set up, but they wanted to fund it without it being linked back to the Met Police. They didn't want the IRA to know there was any connection with the police and this plane. And it was in the early days, before we had satellites filming details on the Earth, they were using this plane with camera equipment that could photograph a Nat's What's It on the ground from up in, so they could actually track and trace the IRA people that they knew were on the mainland. So this was the plan. So they turned to the then deputy head of the whole of the organisation and said, "We need somebody to fund this operation for us, and we want to keep it off the books." So he was an ex-colonel in the military, which is why they turned to him. And he obviously understood about the terrorism threat. And for whatever reason, he picked this guy, Anthony Williams, who was the Deputy Head of Finance, to run the operation. He said to Williams, "Draw me up a plan for how we're going to fund it in secret." So Williams did draw up a plan. But to be fair to his boss, when he drew up the plan, the boss spotted the flaw in it. He said, well, if we follow this plan, there's a risk that, you'll be accused of stealing the money because you're the only person who's got access to everything all the way around. We need a couple of extra controls. Now, the Met had a very old-fashioned filing system. So he wrote this note back to Williams saying, no, we need these extra controls, but agreeing to do the operation. So the file came to Williams. So Williams takes the file, removes the note from his boss saying that we need these extra controls, photocopies it, puts it back without that paragraph, but with a bit saying, yes, I agree, we should go ahead, and then puts that on the file and sends it on to the police for setting up the operation. So nobody apart from his boss knew that paragraph had gone. His boss didn't see the file again, and his boss then died of cancer, so nobody knew his boss had actually... The only reason why we know that note exists, when he was arrested years later, he'd still got the original note at home in his paperwork. That's the only way we know that he cut and pasted that and put it back on the file without it. So he clearly intended to steal from this operation right from the word go. He'd also been stealing from the welfare fund, which he became automatically treasurer of when he became the deputy head of finance. So he stole from that. And staff spotted something was amiss there. And my predecessor at the Met spotted he was fiddling it. But he was a mild-mannered auditor of the type that doesn't say boo to a goose. So he went along to the committee meeting to report that the guy had been stealing money from it. And of course, the guy was at the committee meeting as the treasurer. And he said, no, I didn't steal any money. I made a mistake. I used the wrong account to pay the interest off. Here's my check to put the right amount back. And they all said, that's fine. And he didn't say, I know that you were fiddling it. And he just kept his mouth shut and went back to his staff and said, nobody's listening to me. Now, if that had been me, I'd have been round banging on the commissioner's door about 5 minutes later. But I wasn't there then. But on the back of that, when I did arrive, one of the first jobs I had to do was look at all the details of how Williams had done his fraud to make sure that nobody else could do that. Then go out there, look at all the covert areas and poke them around, annoy them all. And that didn't go too well because I couldn't get anybody to tell me the truth about anything. And then we stumbled by chance onto an armed robber with a police contract for works and maintenance. That was quite funny. And nobody believed me. I said, no, you're using an armed robber with a works and maintenance contract. Do you think it's a good idea? And then I found out that the armed robber had also been to robbery squad headquarters at Tower Bridge and had done the DCI's notice board. And he's also changed the locks on the cells. It's just a bloody armed robber. I said, for Christ's sake. At that point, I went to the organised crime group, and the commander there, Roy Ram at the time, famous commander in the Met, Roy came with me, and we went and saw my boss and said, look, we're not using this contractor. He's an armed bloody robber. Get him out of the organisation. But on the back of that, they accepted that perhaps I had a talent they hadn't noticed before. And they agreed I could recruit somebody to sort of do that kind of forensic audit type work. Because I had regular audits to do. And the Met was a £3.5 billion operation when I was there. I had plenty of other work I should be getting on with, not hunting out, crooks and armed robbers with police contracts. They allowed me to recruit somebody. And luckily, I didn't pick an accountant. I picked a retired detective superintendent who'd worked in the fraud squad to be my deputy on that side. And that was nirvana. The moment I appointed him, suddenly all the police went, who are you working for? I'm working for Peter Tickner. Oh, he must be all right then if you're working for him. And they started talking to me. And then suddenly all the doors in the Met opened and I could do my job.
Coppers are notorious, aren't they, for being suspicious of those from outside the organisation. I mean, I can only imagine what it would have been like. And like you say, a master stroke, you bringing on somebody of that rank, commissioned officer, to work with you, because that will have opened doors that otherwise probably would have stayed well and truly shut, I'm sure.
Oh, it did. I mean, within 3 weeks, we went to see the Assistant Commissioner in charge of counter-terrorism, who'd been a staff officer at the same time as this guy. And we ended up, drinks cabinet open, down the road, sharing a bottle of wine. And suddenly, I'm persona grata and I can talk to people in the Met. But there was farcical things going on. They had to subcontract everything because they didn't have enough people to do anything. They subcontracted to some very dodgy people. And police were ringing us up and saying, look, somebody's just turned up with our police vehicle after it's been refitted. And the guy that's turned up is on an outstanding warrant. We've nicked him when he's arrived. That's the guy delivering the vehicles. It was farcical stuff. My name was mud with the senior management because I was poking around on this. And then on top of that, the cost of clearing vehicles. I mean, in those days, we were responsible, not Transport for London, we were responsible for clearing vehicles that were blocking highways and so on. So the Met did this and they had a contract, and it was basically the contractor collected the vehicles and we paid them for rounding up the vehicles, but they were supposed to charge the owner of the vehicle or get the vehicle crushed. They soon realised that quite often the vehicles they were picking up had been abandoned anyway. So instead of trying to contact anybody or crush the vehicles, they just parked them in a car pound and charged us. And suddenly the Met's costs for doing this function went up and up and up every month, and almost kind of exponential curve. So I was called in, what the hell's going on? And I could see immediately what was wrong. And I could see we weren't getting any income, and yet we were spending more than we'd ever spent before on a contract that, in theory, should have been about the same as when our own staff did it. So we started poking around, and then we got contacted by the organised crime group who said, leave one of the car pounds alone. We're monitoring a heroin operation that's going on at that car pound run by the staff. So we got heroin dealers running one car pound. We got another one where armed robbers are trying to get away from the police, and they abandon a vehicle with a gun in it and cash on a roundabout, and they leg it. So the vehicle is taken away for forensic examination in one of these other car pounds. But later that night, somebody breaks in and steals the vehicle, and the gun and the cash was still in it. It hadn't been forensically examined. So you're tearing your hair out at that point. So a detective superintendent in the Met was assigned to work with me, and the two of us just went to have a look at the contracts, the people, what was going on, leaving organised crime to deal with the heroin and people, and we dealt with the rest of it. And then the contractor deliberately went bust, and they were bought out by a French company. And it all went, belly up. But we've worked out what the problem was these vehicles not being scrapped. So we stopped all that nonsense. I got various death threats during this time, which seems to be par for the course in the Met. Everybody seems to get them if you find anything interesting. But we carried on. What I used to say around the Met was, it's very simple. My entire investigative team knows what we're doing, so there's no point in taking me out. It's not going to stop us. And I'm sure that worked in the long term.
Coming up, why Peter was stopped from giving evidence at the infamous Leveson Inquiry in the UK. You had 14 years in that role as Director of Internal Audit for the Met Police. It sounds to me like you were just bouncing from one disaster to the next. Looking back at that 14 years, what was the biggest scalp that you got during that time?
Well, it was nearly the commissioner. But you have to come to that by a backdoor route, and this is what leads to Leveson eventually. There was a couple of things that happened. One of the assistant commissioners in counter-terrorism, when he resigned, blamed his resignation on me and not his womanising and his drinking, but he blamed it on the fact that I'd been looking at his expenses. And he actually said that to the press. No, the reason why I'm resigning is bloody Peter Tickner. He resigned because obviously once he resigned, we couldn't pursue him for anything because it wasn't a criminal matter, it was a internal discipline matter, so that killed the case. But early on in sort of about the time when the new police authority was being created and we were being moved over, we stumbled a couple of other problems that were going on that nobody had been aware of. And one of them involved a linguist. And the linguist was, Met used to use linguists for two things. They either interpreted when they were interviewing a prisoner or a witness, who didn't speak English, or we'd seize documents that are in a foreign language and they translated them for us. And there was a rate for translating per 1,000 words to English. And there was an hourly rate for being present and doing your work as a linguist. So they could get both types of payment. And they were independent contractors. But we employed over 300 of them because there was over 300 different languages spoken in London, so we needed them. So they had a vast army of these part-time linguists. And this guy, the Met suddenly belatedly realised that after I'd been chasing them about all these armed robbers getting in with police contracts, they suddenly realised they'd never vetted the linguists. So they put a new financial vetting form out and said, you've got to fill this in. And this guy refused to fill it in. So they came to us and said, look, this guy won't fill in the financial vetting forms. You've got to investigate him. So I got us to take a random sample of this guy's claim over a 6-month period. And I just got a couple of my ex-detectives to just go out and take the actual claims that had been paid and go to the police units, see what the video footage showed us and find out what was going on. We only took a very small sample of claims. Every single one of them, he claimed double the amount he was entitled to, literally double. So, right, he's clearly bent. So then we started an investigation into his claims. And that one ended up, we got about 100 grand back from him in the end. But while we were investigating that, I said, where does he feature on our list of highest earning linguists? And back came the answer to me, Peter, he's number 14. So I said, right, well, we're starting a new inquiry. We're starting on the highest paid linguist, and we're working our way down until we find an honest one. I have to tell you, we got past 14 before we got to the first honest one. And the best thing of all, the top one, the top linguist was a female who was doing French, Russian and Spanish. She was half Russian. And she had actually earned through this part-time work more than the commissioner had been paid that year. Anyway, so we had her nicked and we let the police case get on with the 10 best cases we had. But we then pursued a civil case, and I went round to the High Court with our lawyer, and we took out a freezing order against her for $250,000. She gets dealt with. She gets a criminal conviction. We get our $250,000 back from the High Court. And, success all round. Everybody's very pleased with us.
And Peter, it seems to me that the pattern that keeps coming up in these investigations is you're identifying sort of low-level fraud, and it's almost like an entry point to investigate high-level sort of wider spread corruption. I mean, just looking at the linguist situation, suddenly there's that realisation, goodness, this is a much bigger issue.
Yeah, I mean, we only got back through the courts about $750,000, but the following year, the linguist bill was $2 million a year less because everybody knew what we were doing and they were genuinely afraid we'd find them. But my favourite memory on that one was the Director of Procurement had been involved in the bent vehicle contractor, had to resign over something else I looked into. The next Director of Procurement also had to resign over something he was doing I was looking into because he hadn't done it properly. So they appointed a third Director of Procurement, and the Met's Director of Finance brought him along to the next meeting of the police authority. And at the end of the meeting, he said to this new Director of Procurement, I want you to introduce you to Peter. He had your two predecessors. And that was the introduction. I think they used to use me as a bogeyman to frighten people.
Now, Peter, you've mentioned in our discussion here the Leveson Inquiry. Now, this would be something that some of our listeners would perhaps have memory of, if not by the label, but what it looked into. This was 2011, so a couple of years after you'd left the Met in 2009. You were actually stopped from giving evidence in the Leveson Inquiry, and this was an inquiry into the culture, practices, ethics of the British press. This followed the News Corp phone hacking scandal, which got a lot of publicity at the time. And this is probably something that our listeners are familiar with because, of course, there was some very high-profile people taking a litigation against News Corp for phone hacking. You became embroiled in that on the back of some of the work I think that you had done within the Met Police, but you were stopped from giving evidence. There's an interesting story to tell there.
Oh, there's a story. Obviously, before I left the Met, we had a couple of cases crop up. One of them was an allegation by the then head of counterterrorism that the police authority had leaked a confidential briefing about counterterrorism. So with my head of investigations, we looked into the alleged leak. And what we actually found was a series of incompetent pieces of activity and behaviour, including a terrorism briefing with the induction loop left on, so any passing deaf person could have actually picked up the briefing in their induction device and had the terrorism briefing while they were walking past the building. We also found that somebody had concealed a secret microphone under the table in where the meeting had been held. And we found that 2 members of staff had been careless with information. But what we also found, there wasn't a single thing said at the briefing that hadn't already been leaked to the press before the briefing. And we did that by analysing the newspapers all the way back, so we knew that the police authority members couldn't have leaked anything. It had already been leaked before they'd been briefed. So that then turned my attention to the head of counterterrorism. And where had he been the afternoon before the briefing? He'd been down the pub with 4 journalists all afternoon. Funny that. So that was one thing I was aware of before the press briefings. I knew that clearly that the source of the leak was not as people thought. But then another case came our way, quite out of the blue, and this involved the commissioner himself. There was an allegation, we had a phone call to the police authority to say that a national newspaper was thinking of running a 2-page spread about how the commissioner's skiing partner had been awarded a police contract. This was news to all of us. So 2 days later, my chief executive is hammering at my door going, Peter, we've got the press all round our ears, they're going to run with a big story on Saturday. What's in those bloody papers? I haven't got them, Catherine. They haven't arrived. Well, chase it up, find out what the hell's going on. The Met Police, we didn't do our own storage of our case files. We had too many. So we gave them, the Ministry of Defence had a really big storage establishment, so we just used to give them all to the MOD. So we put in a request to the MOD for all the case papers about the award of this contract. Nothing happened. So I sent one of my guys down to the MOD. And I said, well, we sent the papers a day ago, but a team came from the Commissioner's office and said they had a priority over you and it's gone to the Commissioner. So the allegations were about the Commissioner and the papers had gone to the Commissioner's office. I could not believe what I was hearing. By now, this was the Friday. So I rang up my chief executive and I said, Catherine, this is ridiculous. The papers have gone to the Commissioner's office. I said, this is absolutely outrageous in the circumstances. You're going to have to call him and tell him he's going to have to hand them to me on Monday morning, pronto, and he's not to bloody touch them, because if he does, it's going to, all hell will break loose. She said, good point, Peter. I'll speak to Ian. Because Ian Blair was the Commissioner at the time. Anyway, on the Monday morning, I went into work early with my head of investigations, and when we arrived, Catherine plagued me a voicemail, basically with Ian saying, yes, of course Peter must have the papers to investigate. We realise that. We just needed them to answer the press query. And claiming he hadn't looked at them and, they were just there. So fine, I said, right. So I went over with my head of investigations to seize the papers from the Deputy Commissioner's office where they were, allegedly. When I got there, the then Staff Officer Deputy Commissioner is one Neil Bazoo's, now the head of counter-terrorism, by the way. He said, well, we haven't got them. They're in an office across the corridor. So we went across the office across the corridor, and this was the Director of IT's office, because it was an IT contract. And that's where the papers were. But she was on holiday, and behind her desk was a police sergeant. So I said to him, I've come about those papers that have been here over the weekend. He said, oh yeah, they were pouring through them on Saturday. He didn't know not to tell me that. And I took papers into my own office, and I read them myself. I didn't let anybody else on the team see them. I locked my office door, I went in there, and I spent all day and all evening reading every single document we'd seized. And I soon worked out what had actually happened. And it wasn't right. It was clearly not right. So I rang Catherine up at 8 o'clock and I said, we're going to have to call in the Home Office and we're going to have an independent inquiry into our own Commissioner. I'm sorry. When I left my office that night, I literally took one of my hairs off like they do in the movies, and I put it across the lock on my door to make sure that I knew if anybody disturbed it overnight. I know what they're like. Anyway, everything was in place in the morning, so I knew nobody had touched my papers. But some of that information in the papers I had ended up in the press that day. Now, I know I hadn't leaked it. I know the papers were in my office, and the only other copy was in the Deputy Commissioner's office. So who, I wonder, had leaked it? Anyway, so an independent person is called in. Sir Ronnie Flanagan, who'd been the head of the Northern Ireland Police, was called in to do the independent investigation. He concludes Ian's done nothing wrong and the Chief Executive and me should be investigated for looking into him. So again, he's told to back off and go and write a report about the right things. Unfortunately for him, one of his team working on the paperwork knew me and my head of investigations. So she saw all the paperwork that I'd seized and she read it. And after Ronnie Flanagan concluded nothing was wrong, she rang me up and said, Peter, you were right about everything. Never mind what anybody tells you. I saw those papers. You were right about everything. I was about to retire from them anyway because I'd found another scandal. We'd given £30 million to Landsbanki when the Treasurer told us not to. And the day before Landsbanki went bust with £30 million of Met Police funds. Brilliant. Another extraordinary cock-up. And then they announced this Leveson Inquiry in two parts. Obviously, there was a part about the operational side of policing, and there was a part about the police and the press. Now, when it came to the police and the press, I thought, well, I know there was this business about the leak that wasn't, and how did it get to the press? And I know there's this business about how did the information about Ian Blair's contract get leaked when half of it was in storage in the MOD, and the other half I seized from the Deputy's office and was in my office. How the hell did it get? Well, there was only one way it could have done. And the other thing was when head of counter-terrorism, who'd complained about the leak, then later resigned and blamed me, one of the things that appeared in the press was a quote from me saying that, of course, it had been said that what happens if he's been drinking and womanising and there's a bomb incident in London and he's pissed. Now, I'd actually said that to the Deputy Commissioner. I'd actually shouted at the Deputy Commissioner when we were having a row about why I was investigating his expenses. I said, look, he's had lunch with a chief constable of another force. He's used our corporate cards and he spent 400 quid on it. There's no bloody food on that corporate card. It's just all alcohol. I said, what kind of a lunch is that you spend 400 quid on alcohol with two of you? The Deputy Commissioner said, what do you mean? I said, what happens if a bomb goes off and he's pissed and he's in charge of counter-terrorism? And I actually said those words and they appeared in print in the press 6 months later. Now, who could have leaked them? Me? No. Who was the other party? The person who was then the Deputy Commissioner who became the Commissioner. What happened to that Deputy Commissioner? He had to resign after accepting hospitality at Champneys without declaring it. So he had to fall on his sword as well. Ian had already gone by then. And both of them gave evidence to the Leveson Inquiry about their version of events. So I contacted the Leveson Inquiry myself. And Leveson's sidekick invited me round to the High Court to see her. So I made a statement. I didn't see any problem with it because it actually showed that Ian Blair was stitched up. So why would Ian object to me giving evidence that showed he was actually stitched up in the first place? They'd already run the court case, that they hadn't done anything criminal. The Daily Mail had to pay out for naming the two of them. And all I'd found out was that Ian Blair had been shafted by an internal senior member of staff. So what was the problem with Ian objecting to me giving evidence that said that? Anyway, I was told I was giving evidence along with somebody else who was giving evidence of a controversial nature. I think there was about 3 of us that morning on a particular day. By now, I'd left, and I was acting as a consultant for the Care Quality Commission. And I was advising them on fraud and corruption. I was investigating a case for them in the Midlands. So I'm in there investigating a case in the Midlands, not thinking about giving my evidence the next day, because I know what's in the statement. When Press Association ring me up and say, "Can you tell us why you're not giving evidence to the Leveson Inquiry?" I said, "As far as I know, I am. Nobody's told me I'm not." Then, later in the day, Leveson's sidekick contacts me and says, "Peter, the Mets QC's raised an objection, so we're going to have a preliminary hearing in the morning. Don't come, because it won't happen on that day anyway. And we're going to decide what we're going to do when we've heard what they have to say." So they hear what they have to say, and nothing happens. So I said, for God's sake, what's wrong with me giving evidence? I was the blasted chief auditor there at the time. I knew what I was doing, and I did internal leak inquiries. I did investigations. I ran the blasted things. Why am I not giving evidence? Well, Lord Leveson has looked at your evidence and found that it contradicts 2 former commissioners who'd already given their evidence. And he doesn't want to call them back to explain. And he feels it's too complicated to work out whether you're telling the truth or they are. And it's very simple. I always tell the truth. Let's start from there and work our way forwards, shall we? So nothing happened. I'd retired, so I thought, sod this. So I did a PhD in criminology, and I now am an honorary lecturer at the University of Portsmouth, and I teach their students about how corrupt and fraudulent things are and what to do about it. And I do that for free, just for fun. I write books about how to be a frauditor. And they all hate me.
Peter, I just want to thank you so very much for taking the time to join us. 40 years plus as an auditor through the National Health Service, Her Majesty's Treasury, and then across at the Met Office. I want to thank you for your time, but I also want to thank you for your service to the good people of the UK, because so much of the work that you and others in your field do goes under the radar. But Peter, thanks for your time, and it's been a very, very enlightening discussion. My guest this week was Dr. Peter Tickner, who's written 3 books on what he calls frauditing, digging deep in powerful institutions to weed out corruption. Join us next week for another episode of Crime Insiders Forensics. I'm Brent Sanders, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.